Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm in the middle of one of the most random, jam-packed, wonderful 24-hour periods of my life. I don't know how it's happened, and I'll tell you about it if you want to know, but I'll spare you the details at least right now. But last night, Friday night, of course, I work at Baldwin Wallace Conservatory of Music. It's a wonderful place to work. There are fringe benefits, one of which is they have the most wonderful orchestra concerts. And there was one last night, and I decided to go. They were playing, among other things, Benjamin Britten's A Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, which is just a brilliant piece. And what a luxury to be able to have a community that can play such a thing. It was very beautifully executed. I'm still thinking about how good it was. And I was there soon after work, so I was wearing my piano tuner's uniform, which was plaid shirt, suspenders, and tennis shoes, and pants, you know, that kind of thing. I wasn't dressed up for the orchestra, shall we say, and at halftime, we don't call it halftime, intermission, at intermission, a lovely woman came out, Helen Rathburn, who's in charge of the Friends of the Conservatory. It used to be called the Women's Committee, but then a man wanted to join, so now it's called Friends of the Conservatory. And Friends of the Conservatory does a lot for students and for the conservatory in general and for the community. And they're always finding ways to raise money, and they had a lottery going, which I forgot that I had bought a ticket for. And they had the drawing, and it's for, you get your choice of either Cavs tickets, Indians tickets, Browns tickets, no one's picking those, Cedar Point tickets, Cleveland Orchestra tickets, and $100 to spend how you want. And the concert master picked winning the ticket, and Helen picked it up and read it and said, "Oh my goodness, Mark Graham." And so Mark Graham stood up, and it was a very weird night. It was wonderful. You know, the orchestra was the main thing, but I sort of felt like the lottery was really the main event of the evening. I usually hide on Friday nights. I don't want people to know that I come out on Friday nights, and there I was in front of everyone. But my question for you is, how do you know that the wonderful, and she's an absolutely delightful person, the wonderful Helen Rathburn, and I hope she'll never listen to this sermonette, how do you know that she's not a Church of God person, just from that? Besides the fact that she's there on Friday nights doing lottery drawings. And the answer is, Church of God people would not say, should not say, "Oh my goodness." And why do we not do that? And that's what I want to talk about today, because I'm hearing things like that creeping into our family, and I'm not sure that people even, you know, we have so many old-timers and new-timers, I'm not sure that we've ever really talked about that. It's pretty basic, and it's a gentle type thing, and it's an easy thing, because it has to do with one of the 10 Commandments. In our teen Bible studies, the first thing we do is we drill the 10 Commandments. We go over them. So I don't know if you can name immediately what the third commandment is, but you certainly know where to find them. They're in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. And the third commandment, shortened, is you shall not take God's name in vain. And of course, we don't want to. We never want to. You know, when I grew up, we didn't do that kind of thing. People very rarely said, "Oh my," very rarely did that. And now it's just a part of sitcoms and playground play. I mean, it's something that happens all the time. And I know that all of us want to keep the 10 Commandments, and all of us want to have a relationship with God and obey Him. And I don't know if we even think about why we don't want to take God's name in vain. I think there's a very interesting verse in the book of Genesis, chapter 4, at the end of Genesis chapter 4, and you may wonder, well, what does this even have to do with taking God's name in vain? But it's one of those verses where you know the verse and you've read the verse, but if you stop and think about it, suddenly it takes on some meanings that you might not have thought about. And in Genesis 4, at the very end, and it's after the story of Cain and Abel, of course, Adam and Eve have long since left the Garden of Eden, And it talks about Cain's descendants, so some time has gone by, and in verse 25 it mentions that although Abel had died, that Adam and Eve had another son named Seth. And Seth had a son named Enosh. And so some time had gone by since the events of the recreation of the earth. But in the very last sentence of Genesis 4 and verse 26, it says, and this is New International, there's different ways to translate this, but it says, at that time men began to call on the name of the Lord. And of course we call on the name of the Lord all the time, but the reason that verse is there is that something changed at that point. And suddenly at that point they had to call on the name of the Lord. And you think, well, what could that be? Well, the answer is that God had different ways of communicating with people. At the very beginning, as you know, he walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. He talked to Cain and Abel in very clear words that they could understand. Not sure what the language was, but they communicated. And it seems like it was person to person. I don't know if we would say face to face, because I don't know what it was like talking to our God when he was on the earth. But all we know is that at this time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. And it means that he wasn't there and that you had to call on him. And one of the reasons it's so important not to take God's name in vain is that we do call on God. And when we use God's name, we need to mean God's name. We don't want to use it casually. And so, you know what OMG stands for in text. It's a very casual use. It offends me every time I see it, but there's nothing I can do about it. I mean, it's so widespread at this point, except not use it myself. And so we don't call on the name of the Lord in vain. In vain, we don't do it for no good reason. It's perfectly fine to call on the name of the Lord, but we don't do it in vain. That's what we're commanded not to do. When we call on the name of God, we mean it. And there are interesting things. I mean, it took on different developments over the years and thousands of years of civilization. There was a time, even the God's servant Elisha, who definitely communicated with God and definitely was on God's wavelength and definitely did things the way God wanted a human being to do. Elisha used the phrase, "As the Lord lives, I will do this." And technically, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's swearing by the name of the Lord. But technically, if you fulfill it, that's not wrong, and Elisha did fulfill it. But later on, if you look up the phrase, one of the things that God condemned Israel for was saying, "As the Lord lives," and then not doing what they said, not meaning it at all. And so they were calling on the name of God in vain. And so it took on different meanings. It wasn't just calling on God, it was also swearing by God and using God. You know, that used to be a phrase. You don't hear it very much anymore. And I hate to use these phrases out loud, but it's a teaching type of thing. People used to say, I remember my great-grandfather saying it actually, by God. And he meant it as just when he was angry or something like that, or at a person or something like that, and he was taking God's name in vain. We don't say that much anymore. We have other ways of doing it. But that was a form of swearing. And that's why we call taking God's name in vain swearing, because we're saying things will happen by whatever authority. And Jesus had something to say about that. In Matthew 5, we looked at this last week in Youth Bible Study, and you can be proud of your young people, because in Matthew 5, I said, why is this section called the Sermon on the Mount? And they knew, because it was a sermon and it was on a mount. You can be very, very proud of them. They came up with that right away, didn't even need to think about it. But in this chapter, in verse 33, this is Jesus Christ himself speaking. He says, Matthew 5:33, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but keep the oaths that you have made to the Lord.' But I tell you," this is Jesus speaking, "do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne," and that was an old oath, you know. You read about it in knights saying, "by heaven." It's not a phrase that we use. Or we don't swear by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. So our actions speak for themselves. We don't have to swear to verify our actions. And I think many of you know that when a Church of God person is called into court, we don't have to swear. We don't have to swear an oath to tell the truth. We can affirm an oath. And it may seem like a technicality, but it is something that's available to you. And we want to obey God in the big things and in the little things. And so we don't take God's name in vain. We certainly don't, when we're angry, we don't yell, or we don't take Jesus Christ's name in vain. But I wonder if you've thought about all the other ways that people go about it without actually invoking the name of God or Jesus Christ. And we talked about this last week in our Bible study, and some of it seemed a little ridiculous, but it's all worth thinking about. We don't say, oh my gosh. We don't say, oh my goodness. We don't say golly. We don't say things like that. But then there's things that get almost silly, because people would try to find ways to yell the name Jesus Christ without saying the name of our Savior. And they would say things like, believe it or not, this is taking God's name in vain. They would say, Jeepers Creepers. That's a euphemism. They would say, Judas Priest. They would say, believe it or not, Jiminy Cricket. I think when you're talking about the movie Pinocchio, it's okay to talk about Jiminy Cricket. But the reason that name was cute in that day was it was an oath. What people would hit their thumb with a hammer. Last week I said hit their hammer with a thumb, and I didn't hear the end of it for a long time. But if you hit your thumb with a hammer, sometimes people would yell, Jiminy Cricket. And that's taking God's name in vain. And we don't do it, and we want to be really careful. And it gets to the point where you wonder if you can say anything at all, and that's what Jesus was saying, was you have to be careful. Because then you reach the point where a woman might say, oh my goodness, and you realize that that's also a euphemism. And even I find myself saying, oh my, and the question would be, oh my what? And so we need to be very careful. You hear the phrase, good heavens, good grief. But what are those short for? What are the euphemisms for? And it may seem like I'm being ultra picky, but I love God. And I know you do too. And I know that he's a family member for you, and that you want to please him, and that we want to obey him. And it's important enough to God to put this in front of our minds that he made it 1/10 of the 10 Commandments, that we don't take God's name in vain. So it's worth thinking about. And we're a family. We're allowed to annoy each other. We do it all the time. If you hear someone saying it, you might bring it to their attention in a gentle, kind way, not in a condemning way, because Jesus wasn't that way. And the problem is, of course, is that we all do it. So it's certainly not a condemning thing. I was on Facebook a couple years ago, and one of the problems where we live, if you call it a problem, it's really kind of a lovely thing if you think about it, but we are inundated with wildlife. Good wildlife, beautiful wildlife. Our dog thinks every one of them is interesting, and I used to also before they started eating my plants and eating them to the ground. And I think the deer had eaten my daylilies, and what the deer do, it's not enough for them to be deer and eat your daylilies. What they do, they like the crunchy buds on the daylilies. They like dill pickles to them. They really like those buds. The flowers don't mean so much to them. So what they do is they come in and bite off the flower and drop it on the ground to show you that they're in charge. And then they eat the buds. And so you walk out, and not only are your daylilies demolished, but they've left calling cards all over the place. And I think at that point, I went in, and on Facebook, I wrote, these doggone deer, I can't stand them. And, I wish they were all gone. I don't even remember what I wrote, but I used that word. And a church woman from far away, but, Facebook's Facebook, private messaged me and said, did you really mean that you wanted God to damn those deer? Well, it turns out that was actually pretty close to my sentiments at that point. So I thought about it. And then I thought, well, no, I didn't. That God made the deer, And the deer are wonderful in their own way. They're doing what they're made to do. And they live there too, and they don't recognize the fact that I pay property taxes and I own that property. The deer could care less at that point. And so I realized that this woman had done me an immense favor, that she had saved me from doing something that I didn't want to do, that she pointed out something that I just, in a moment of frivolity, just said without thinking about. And she had the kindness to do it in private. She didn't just write a comment saying, "You idiot, you just broke one of the 10 Commandments." What she said was, "Did you mean to say that?" And I had to thank her, which I find annoying when other people are right and you're wrong. And they're really doing you a favor. She was absolutely correct, and she was being a daughter of God at that point, and she did me a favor. So there's no harm in helping people along these lines, because it's amazing how much it comes up in life, and we don't even think about it. And yet it's important to God. In the book of Zephaniah, you don't even know where Zephaniah is, do you? Yes, you do. It's the third to the last, I guess, book of the Old Testament. And it's worth reading in its entirety, but we really only turn to Zephaniah for one particular verse. And that's exactly the verse that we're going to turn to right now, is in Zephaniah. So the last book of the Old Testament is Malachi, and then before that is Zechariah, and before that is Haggai, and right before that is Zephaniah. And we're in Zephaniah chapter 3. And of course, Zephaniah has a lot to say, but we often call on him for this one verse in Zephaniah 3 and verse 9, and it's talking about a time ahead of us. And it's uplifting, as all those verses are. Zephaniah 3 and verse 9, it says, "Then I will purify," this is God speaking, "then I will purify the lips of the people, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder, as a family, as a unit, as God's children." And it goes on to talk about more things and how our natures will be changed and we won't be haughty and proud anymore, but that we'll serve with meekness and humility and trust in the name of the Lord. But I think it's so beautiful that God will purify the language. And in other translations it says, "I'll give people a new tongue." We don't even know what it is. We assume it's English, but we don't know that. It's not, of course. We have no idea what it is. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that we'll have different words. I mean, we still might communicate with words that we understand today, but it means that we'll speak to each other freely and purely and as children of God, never taking God's name in vain. So I just wanted to call that to your attention as a family, that it's something we don't do, and let's help each other to be closer to God and to have our tongues be pure now.